Hello again. Experts have been warning us for decades that climate change is the single biggest threat to humanity's survival. And now finally we see the proof right in front of us. Record heat waves in Europe, flash floods and other extreme weather events are now our new normal. Locally, we saw this April's devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal and the frequent flash flooding in low-lying areas like Alexandra here in Gauteng. The only question now is whether it's too late to turn things around. And even if we did, what is our best case scenario? Yeah, and I saw a question as I was preparing here. How do we know really now that climate change is a reality? Okay, let's discuss this now. I'm joined by a panel of experts. I've got Dhesigen Naidoo. He's a climate energy. He's an expert. He's an author at the Institute for Security Studies. We also have Gaylor Montmasson-Clair, senior economist at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies. And finally, last but not least, Mitchelle Mhaka, who's the Programs Coordinator for African Climate Alliance. Can I start with you, Mitchelle? How do we know that climate change is real?
I think you've just said it in your opening statement. It's as real as it gets. What we saw in April, what is currently being experienced, and what I guess prompted this discussion in the UK, those are all very real, tangible things that point to how real climate change is. But we're also seeing so many other different things across the world. But it's here and it's real. It's as real as you and I.
Yeah. Gaylor, how much these kinds of extreme heat waves like we are witnessing in Europe? In the next hour, I'm going to be talking to our correspondent in London, Oli Barrett there. How much of are these kind of heat waves down to climate change?
Well, I think it's quite clear that because of climate change, we have a lot more of those heat waves, and they are harsher as well. And I don't think you could pinpoint one single event, but the occurrence of those events and their strengths, it's clear that it's being linked to a change in climate. And so we see more floods, we see heat waves coming, and they hit us more often and harder. And that's true in Europe, but that's true, of course, here in the region in Southern Africa. Because when the rest of the world is looking at an increase in temperature of, let's say, 2 degrees, well, here in Southern Africa, we're looking at double that, actually. So we're going to be hit very hard by the changes going forward.
Dhesigen, does climate change also mean extreme cold as well? I mean, we're just focusing on the heat waves now because it's very much in the news due to what's happening in Europe. But does climate change also mean more extreme cold weather?
Not really. That hasn't come out in any of the analyses. I mean, we will have cold snaps now and again, but not with an increasing frequency. I mean, the overall issues that we have to worry about is one is that generally the average temperatures are moving upwards. We talk about this plus 1.5 degrees Celsius as some very far point in the future. The reality is that we're already at 1.1 degrees above that 1990 normal. It's already there. And the chances of us containing that below 1.5 by 2050 is going to be highly problematic. Then there's the issue of how that has an impact on sea temperatures, on sea level rise, and one of the phenomena that is now used to explain the heat waves in Europe is in fact this phenomenon of this weakening North Atlantic pump system. So the circulation in the world is also changing, and so we don't have a good chance of a short-term new ice age. It's moving in the opposite direction, and it's getting more and more devastating.
So climate change is getting devastating. It's speeding up. So, Mitchelle, should we expect, or are we going to experience this kind of extreme weather phenomena, like the heat wave that Europe is going through now, more frequently into the future?
Absolutely. I mean, that is one of the effects of climate change, is that natural disasters become more devastating and more frequent. And what that means is that there is a great number of people who lose their lives, their livelihoods, economic activity goes down, as you can imagine, infrastructure is also damaged in the process. So this is something that we're looking, this will become a new normal, as difficult as it might be to actually accept. It's here. I mean, if you look at specifically KZN as an example, you see that the disasters that are hitting KZN are becoming a lot more frequent after maybe every 2 years, whereas in the past it hasn't been so. And so this is just one specific example that we can look at, but this is the sort of reality that we are forced to come to terms with.
So the temperatures are going higher. Dhesigen, you were saying there 1.1 currently, and that 1.5 is not far away. With what we've seen happening currently in Europe, I just need to ask this question first. I'll ask you, Gaylor. How ready do you think we are? You said it's going to get harsher here. What Europe is going through will be worse in this part of the world. How ready are we? How ready is South Africa to deal with such high temperatures?
We're not. That's that's the worrying part. I was looking at some of the data, and there's already, according to the South African government, 22 million people that have already been impacted by climatic impacts in South Africa to date from 1980. That's 113 billion rands of economic losses already. And the harsh reality is that it's the people who are the most vulnerable who are going to be hit the hardest. People and businesses that have the means to kind of adapt or move will do so, but the bulk of the population will be left stranded to deal with those impacts when it comes to harsher temperature, sea level rise, floods. And we are not ready. We have put forward internationally what we want to do, both in terms of mitigation to reduce our emissions, and in terms of adaptation to increase our resilience. But we are only at the beginning of the implementation of that plan, and we need a sizable amount of support, of finance, of technologies, and of behavioral change as well to implement those plans. So we have a lot of work ahead to reduce our emissions, make sure that we're resilient, and on top of that, try to make sure that the transition that we're going through is inclusive and just, so that we bring everyone into this transition, and it's not just the ones that have the means to do that will do it, but that we bring everyone along.
Now, Gaylor, this again, as Gaylor is saying, if some 22 million South Africans, according to the research he's quoting, they are already impacted by climate change, by these rising temperatures and all the severe weather systems. What can we do? I mean, in your perspective, the readiness, he says, is not there. What is your research at the ISS showing?
Well, look, it's the ISS on the one hand, but it's also the work of the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa on the other. And there are other climate commissions that are starting to bud up elsewhere in the continent as well. It's saying that there are two things that have to happen, and they both have to happen urgently. The first is that we have to do this energy switch. We have to decrease our own contribution to this global warming effect. Not only because we want to reduce the global warming, which is good enough a reason to do it, but because as the rest of the world changes into this green taxonomy, this green way of doing things, trade rules are going to change in a drastic way. And if we're not up to speed, we will stop being an export economy. And we will no longer be competitive in a global market. It will cost us many, many more billions of rands into the future. The other thing we have to do in parallel is that we have to invest in adaptation. We have to organize for ourselves as a country to be better equipped to be able to deal with this increasing weather. I mean, Gaylor's talking about the 22 million people that are affected very directly, but indirectly, all of us are affected. Health profiles are changing. New vectors that operate at higher temperatures are becoming real. I mean, we're becoming an increasingly malaria vulnerable country, for example, because of this increase in temperature. It brings other burdens into the system. And there's the issue about human physical limits. You know, human beings can't thrive in a 45-degree world. It's just impossible. You're going to have to be indoors all of the time. And those are the realities that those parallel investments must happen. But I think we must think about it in a smarter way as well. And that smarter way is this high carbon economy that's generating this global warming has not delivered on the things that we really need. I mean, we live in a country with high poverty and unemployment and inequality. So in the way we transition justly towards a low carbon economy to deal with the global warming, we have, I think, and the stats are showing, a better chance to actually deal with the poverty and the unemployment and the inequality to a more positive future.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, I'm glad you're mentioning poverty, because if somebody's hungry today, the last thought on their minds as they wake up is climate change. Because they're battling to make sure that the family is fine, to put something on the table. But the worse the weather systems become, the more severe, poverty is going to be even worsened. So you really have to be doing something. From an African perspective, Mitchelle, can I ask you, I saw a headline a few weeks ago about the responsibility for an African country like South Africa globally to step up what was called, climate change diplomacy. I mean, we know there was a COP26 now, just a few months ago in Glasgow, in Scotland. But still, what more do you think a country like South Africa, as part of the continent, should be doing more of in order to address the gaps?
I think what South Africa should be doing is really just put in a lot of effort into ensuring that the country and the masses, which we know are a lot of the times disadvantaged, coming from poverty-stricken areas, making sure that those communities are able to become resilient. That means actually investing in adaptation measures. That also means that when we do start speaking about climate change, we don't just term it climate change, right? So if you go into an area that is vulnerable and you say we should worry about climate change, that doesn't make sense. You need to start addressing things that are very real, like food security. How do we do that? We start organizing for communities to be self-sufficient when it comes to food production, for instance, food gardens and other such things. And so what should happen is these efforts should really start from the ground up. That means that by the time we get to COP27, COP26 and other such global conferences, we're actually doing something back home on the ground. That means that the people who don't have the privilege to maybe even tune in and watch this discussion are still being given a fighting chance to be able to represent themselves, or even fight for themselves. Because one thing that we do as climate activists, as organizations, as other such people who are doing all of this to try and curb the effects of climate change, what we do is we get into this state of saviorism, and a lot of the times forget that people can fight for themselves in this case. And so what we do need to be doing, and what we do need to be seeing from South Africa, and that would be probably from a governance sort of perspective, is to prioritize climate change as a topic that should be taught in schools. That also means it comes with things like adaptation and mitigation. What are those things and what do they mean? That means that the education needs to be very comprehensive. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is we need to realize the intersectionalities that exist. So what does climate change do to a society? It worsens poverty. It means that the society becomes food insecure. It means that the access to education drops. It means that there are a lot of dramatic negative effects that are directly linked to climate change. And South Africa is very, very vulnerable. And so those are some of the things that we need to realize. And what needs to be done by government specifically is to prioritize climate change as something that's taught in schools and even after.
Yeah, and use practical examples and talk in the practical language about scarcity of water or whatever, rather than use the word climate change. Dhesigen, you wrote about this in January, about Africa's the climate change diplomacy of African countries. And at the time, you had a particular view in January when you wrote your article, which I've read. Has your opinion changed now? Is Africa doing enough as a continent to make sure we are firmly on the foot towards a low-carbon diet future?
Well, the African diplomatic initiative is pretty good. I mean, institutionally, we have better institutions on the African continent, interestingly, compared to the rest of the world. I mean, there's no other region in the world that has a head of state committee dealing with climate change specifically. It's currently chaired by Kenya. It was previously chaired by South Africa. And we've made some big resolutions as a continent in the UN Security Council and are leading the debate. And COP27 is the Africa COP. It's going to happen in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. But we don't have the physical means to make the big transition that is required. And given that the North has been responsible for producing this carbon dioxide under which we are taking the negative consequences, they really need to come up with it. They need to put their money to deal with the loss and damages on the African continent. They need to up the game on the adaptation agenda to help us adapt to a new way of doing things. And the opportunity, of course, is that this continent is least embedded in the current development model. So we don't have to retrofit things. We can move directly into a low carbon paradigm around our economic development. But the northern players have to come to the party. They have to put up that 100 billion that has already been agreed to. They need to actually double that and recognize that this continent is, in fact, the global laboratory that is available for a low carbon future with a normal temperature.
Okay, we got about 4 or so minutes left, and in this last few minutes, I just want to talk to you, just to get your thoughts about what can we personally do? What are your thoughts about what you, Dhesigen, me, Dan, you, Mitchelle, you, Gaylor, what can we personally do? Yes, we're talking about what governments must be doing now, and you're very clear that there's a bigger role, that we all are clear that there's institutions and the governments must play a bigger role, especially those in the north, as you've just said, Dhesigen. I mean, global temperature is rising. You've given us examples of that. The ocean is getting warmer, and the glaciers are retreating, we are told, and Europe is now suffering that the sea level is also rising. So what can we personally do? Can I start with you, Gaylor?
I think, there's of course a lot of small incremental individual actions that we can take as human beings, and they all matter. But we have to acknowledge, particularly in South Africa and on the African continent, as it was raised already, that Africa is not responsible for the vast majority of climate change. And I think the single most important action that actually people can take is to lobby their government and the corporations that are responsible for climate change to take action. And I think that's the most powerful kind of intervention that we can take. Of course, at an individual level, you can do all sorts of things, but we must not feel like we are moving the blame to individual people who, in most cases, are not responsible for the problem. And I think that's quite important, that we don't end up pushing the blame too quickly on citizens and consumers who, for most, are not responsible for the problem and are just trying to survive.
Okay, you make a very point there, and you didn't see her, but I can see Mitchelle is nodding her head. Mitchelle, what can we personally do? I'm not trying to shift the blame from the multinationals, the industrialists, people who've been polluting our air here and carbon emissions. But I'm just saying, as a person, I mean, this is our world after all. What can we personally do?
I mean, I do agree with Gaylor. But I also must say that, and this is a story I always tell, which I won't tell because of time, but I got into the space mainly because I needed to see more people who look like me. So one thing that we need to start doing is actually see representation of people advocating for the same issues. Second is that we need civil society organizations to be empowered, because we see that when they are empowered, they're able to make all of the maybe not all of the necessary change, but they're able to start moving in the correct direction, right? In terms of climate literacy, right, we see that South Africa is not a very climate literate country. And so the African Climate Alliance is doing work in that regard. We've got a network called the Adaptation Network that is dealing specifically with adaptation. So these are some of the things that individuals can do to try and curb the problem, while still obviously holding governments and institutions accountable. So there are very real things that we can do. But first is that we need to all collectively work toward making sure that our society is conscious about such issues in whatever way and capacity we can, on the bus, on the way to school, on the way to work, all of that stuff. That is all very real effort that really, really translates into something powerful when it's put together.
Yeah, and I guess we in the media can do more. I mean, we shouldn't just be doing this kind of discussions when there's a heat wave in Europe or where there are floods in KwaZulu-Natal. We should find a way, we in the mainstream news media, of keeping this on the daily news agenda one way or another. I'll speak to my boss, John Bailey, after this. He's our managing editor, to see what we can be doing about it. Dhesigen, last thoughts for you. What can we be personally doing?
Well, just to endorse what Mitchelle and Gaylor have said, the big thing to do is to get involved, to agitate for the change. We know it needs to happen, and we must crowdsource capacity to make that happen. But the small thing that we can do, and this is going to make me unpopular with the eNCA viewers, is change your diet. That's the immediate thing that you can do. You can move from a high-carbon diet of steaks and sausages to a low-carbon diet of vegetables and fruit. And if everyone did this at scale,
Michelle is laughing. Michelle is laughing, Dhesigen. Michelle is laughing, especially when you said steak and sausages. She's laughing. Anyway, continue, Dhesigen. Sorry. Okay, continue.
No, but I think we must realize our part in the story and our agency. So if we do things like that, change the diet, change the way we get around, we will make differences. Because if we do that at scale, this is what tips it over.
Yeah, I saw somebody who says...
And in the meantime, we must get the 100 billion from the north.
Yeah, we must continue to lobby and agitate. I guess you guys are agreeing there. But the other point, I saw somebody the other day who says they're making a conscious decision to always be conscious about how much power they are using every day and what source is that power. So if you use less power consciously, you are contributing in your own little way, and they don't want to travel as much, flying around in these planes that are burning fossil fuels across our skies. They've also decided they're not going to be hopping on a plane all the time. But thank you very much, Dhesigen. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Gaylor, for your views as we look at the impact of climate change. And it is real. Look at what's happening in Europe. In fact, shortly here on Today, we're going to be staying on these issues about climate change. I'm going to go live to our UK correspondent, Oli Barat, to get an update on the latest on the heat wave that's sweeping across Europe. And many people are being affected, and people have been dying in the last 2 weeks or so.